Grover Cleveland's reputation begins with a sentence he repeats so often it stops sounding like a slogan and starts sounding like a moral reflex. Public office is a public trust. The phrase is spare, almost severe, and it reflects a sensibility forged not in salons or at universities, but in parsonages, law offices, and municipal chambers, where the nearest romance is the romance of balancing a column of numbers. He is born Stephen Grover Cleveland in Caldwell, New Jersey, the son of a Presbyterian minister whose sermons leave the family as rich in admonition as they are poor in cash. Early on, he learns two permanent lessons: that work is both duty and shelter, and that respectability is not a costume, but a habit. When his father dies, the boy goes to work rather than to college, finding in Buffalo a ladder made from law books and late nights. Apprenticing in the old way: read, copy, draft, argue, until the trade is not a trick, but a muscle. He is not a virtuoso, he is a metronome. Clients trust him because his sentences carry weight that is not borrowed from anyone else's name, and because he treats details as if they are the only place where justice will stand quietly long enough to be measured. Buffalo's politics in the post-war years are a familiar American story. Contracts that smell of friends, paving stones that cost more than stones should, councils that confuse the city's money with party money. Cleveland is not a reformer by temperament so much as by reflex. He has the bookkeeper's allergy to waste and the small-town minister's conviction that the 10 Commandments apply to line items. He becomes sheriff of Erie County and does the unpleasant work of signing death warrants and, in at least one instance, attending an execution because the office that calls for such signatures should not be insulated from their consequences. The memory dogs him later as proof to enemies that he is cold and to friends that he is honest out adulthood's costs. As mayor of Buffalo in 1882, he turns the veto into pedagogy, writing messages that read like lectures in constitutional thrift. Where is the public purpose? Who profits? How much? Why this contractor and not the one whose bid is lower? He is not trying to be loved. He is trying to keep the city from becoming a club whose dues are disguised as taxes. Albany notices, New York State is hungry for a governor who will treat the legislature like a bright class that needs discipline. The Democrats nominate him, the voters send him, and Governor Cleveland arrives with a pen sharpened to a point. In Albany, he becomes famous, not for speeches, but for vetoes that read like case law. He refuses private pension bills that smuggle fraud under the cloak of gratitude, insisting that generosity be channeled through general laws rather than favors. He blocks the political construction of a canal board designed to feed friends. He cuts through special franchises that would turn public privileges into private annuities. Newspapers that usually prefer fireworks discover they can fill columns with competence. The phrase about public trust migrates from his mouth into their headlines. It starts to sound like an old truth rediscovered rather than a new slogan minted. The National Party, rummaging for a candidate in 1884, after years of Republican rule flavored by scandal and grievances, lifts him as if he were an honest ledger-writ human. The campaign is venomous. Republicans nominate James G. Blaine, a gifted, worldly politician with a poet's love of applause and a portfolio full of favors. Reformist Republicans, the mugwumps, go the other way, preferring a Democrat they can trust to a Republican they cannot. Cleveland's private life becomes a public cudgel when an old story about a child he acknowledged and supported in Buffalo is thrown into rallies like gravel. He does not lie. He does not counteraccuse. He admits what needs admitting and refuses to pretend that private perfection is the proof of public virtue. Barely, painfully, with New York as the fulcrum, he wins. The first Cleveland administration is an experiment in governing by refusal. Civil service reform, born in tragedy under Arthur, needs a custodian. Cleveland expands the classified service and refuses to route good clerks simply to feed ward healers. He does not keep every promise reformers want. He keeps enough to transform reform from sermon into habit. He directs cabinet officers who treat departments as instruments rather than stages. William C. Endicott, at war, begins modernizing an army that had been living on memories. William C. Whitney, at Navy, buys steel and discipline for a fleet that cannot defend respect with wood. Thomas F. Bayard, at State, speaks softly and keeps the treaty book open. The great public question is the tariff, whether protective walls built to shelter domestic industry after the war have become barriers that trap consumers and breed privilege. In his 1887 message, he writes prose with no perfume and enormous consequence, arguing that a swollen surplus is not a trophy but a sign of overtaxation, that high rates have ripened into private advantages, that the government should take less and take it more fairly. It is an invitation to fight that both parties accept. He also signs the Interstate Commerce Act, creating a federal referee to watch railroads that had grown used to choosing which towns prosper and which wither. The law is cautious, the commission timid by later standards, but a line has been crossed. The national government will not pretend that the largest arteries of commerce are private lanes. The other line he crosses, unintentionally and tragically, is drawn across native lands. The Dawes Act, which he signs in 1887, is an honest error that becomes a monumental injury. It allows for the allotment of tribal lands to individuals, in the belief, common among reformers of the era, that private plots will protect native families from exploitation and teach the arts of citizenship. In practice, it fractures communal life, opens millions of acres to opportunists, and becomes the legal instrument of dispossession salted with good intentions. He understands, dimly, the danger of the frontier's appetites. He does not yet grasp that policy designed to civilize will read, to those subject to it, like a polite way of erasure. This is one of the deep limits of his imagination. He is so attached to rules that he sometimes mistakes them for remedies. He marries Frances Folsom in the White House in 1886, a ceremony that gives the Capitol a story without a committee and the country a glimpse of warmth in the life of a man who seems to prefer the company of statutes. She is half his age, poised, and so adept at making a formal house feel human that the nation learns a new style of affection, less for the husband than for the household. 2 years later, the tariff argument returns as an election, and the arithmetic falls the other way. Benjamin Harrison wins the electoral college while Cleveland wins the popular vote. He leaves with courtesy, returns to New York to practice law, and becomes for 4 years the man a certain kind of American points to when the headlines get noisy and the appropriations get fat, the adult in reserve. Harrison's Congress legislates with a heavy hand. High tariffs, generous pensions, ambitious spending, and the public mood turns back toward the ledger. In 1892, Democrats renominate the old bookkeeper, and the country returns him to office just in time for a storm. Before the oath, he undergoes surgery for a malignant tumor in his jaw, a procedure done aboard a yacht to hide it from a market and a political class addicted to panic. Surgeons cut, reconstruct, and leave him with a jaw of hard rubber and a voice only slightly altered. The secrecy will bother later ages. In context, it reads like an attempt to keep the ship steady while lightning prowls the horizon. Because the panic of 1893 arrives like a weather system rather than a news story. Railroads fail, capital flees, banks wobble, and unemployment becomes a headline that does not stop printing. The Treasury's gold reserve, the talisman of confidence in a currency still learning to live without wartime exceptions, thins alarmingly. Cleveland decides that the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which had obligated the government to buy silver and issue notes redeemable in gold, is a leak in the hull. He summons Congress, fights to repeal, and wins, splitting his own party between gold discipline and silver populism. Confidence does not return on command. The economy continues to shrink, and his enemies accuse him of kneeling to bankers, while his friends watch him lose friends. He is an executive loyal to process in a culture that, in a depression, is tempted by spectacle. The gold reserve falls again in 1895. He engineers a syndicate bond sale with J.P. Morgan that replenishes reserves and steadies the credit of the government. The deal reeks, to many, of deference to Wall Street. To him, it smells like solvent arithmetic. He chooses to be accused of elitism, rather than to risk a currency collapse that would punish the very people his opponents claim to champion. On labor, the Depression tests the limits of his legalism. The Pullman strike of 1894 begins as a quarrel over wages and rent in a company town and spreads through rail yards under Eugene Debs's leadership into a national refusal that entangles mail trains. Cleveland and Attorney General Richard Olney secure injunctions and, when those are ignored, deploy federal troops to enforce the movement of the mails and the obedience due federal courts. Streets burn. Sympathy and resentment rise and fall in different cities at different hours. The president becomes, for many, the symbol of order delivered with the back of the government's hand. He insists that he is not breaking the strike so much as defending the union's enumerated obligations. The argument does not comfort the unemployed or those who watch bayonets in their streets. It does satisfy his conscience. Process before passion, law before rumor, the mail before the mob. The episode hardens the lines of debate that will dominate American politics for a generation: capital and labor, injunction and assembly, federal writ and local sympathy. His second term is coherent, even where it is unpopular. He refuses to abandon civil service reform to the spoils hunters who have rediscovered their appetite under cover of hard times. He expands classifications and insists that competence cannot be made hostage to county committees. He handles tariff reduction with a mixture of aspiration and disgust. The Wilson-Gorman tariff, meant to undo the McKinley Heights, arrives as a compromise crafted by men who count votes before ideas. He allows it to become law without his signature and emits a message that sounds like a schoolmaster's weary rebuke. This is not what reform was supposed to look like. Inside the bill sits an income tax experiment that the Supreme Court will strike down in Pollock. He does not live to see the 16th Amendment write the tax into constitutional stone, but he has helped normalize the idea that the federal government can, when necessary, discover new instruments, provided it does so honestly. On the question of the Hawaiian coup, he shows an instinct for decency that refuses to be bullied by enthusiasm. American residents, with U.S. Marines landed under a previous administration, overturn the Queen. Cleveland withdraws the annexation treaty, sends an investigator who reports the revolution as a sin disguised as progress, and attempts to reverse it. The new Hawaiian regime refuses. Congress declines to push. The moment passes. He accepts that restraint will not sell as well as conquest. He prefers to be right in a minority than wrong with a parade. In the Venezuelan boundary dispute, he sharpens a different edge. He and Secretary of State Richard Olney revive the Monroe Doctrine, not as poetry, but as an instrument. Europe should arbitrate rather than annex by installments. The language is bracing. Britain, calculating costs, chooses arbitration. The result is an American doctrine tested in practice, rather than paraded on anniversaries. It is an irony that pleases him. The man accused of being a banker's stooge in domestic policy becomes the executive who forces the world's leading empire to address a Latin American republic as a party to a legal proceeding, rather than as an inconvenience to be grazed by empire. He believes, deeply, that law is a way to civilize power, and he looks most at home when he can turn that belief into a memorandum that prevents a ship from sailing. There is a texture to his days that tells more than the ledger lines. He is a large man, slow in stride, quick in mind, with a taste for cigars and frank talk. He dislikes factional chatter and tolerates flattery badly. He trusts few and does not cultivate the sort of convivial network that would have softened his unpopularity when policies bit. He walks the halls at night, reviews drafts, crosses out words that seem to stretch beyond the authority of a clause, and writes in the scalpel prose of a lawyer who believes that the precision of language is fairness made visible. He is capable of tenderness, particularly in the shelter of his marriage, but he will not manufacture sentiment in public, to earn what policy has forfeited. He regards popularity as a resource too expensive to buy on credit. His enemies find him stubborn, stiff, even cruel. His friends, fewer as the decade turns rough, find him bracing in a way that makes you check your own work before you bring it to his desk. The judgments of his contemporaries are made under the pressure of bills to be paid and wages to be found. Those who lose their jobs in 1893 and 1894 do not admire a lecture about the gold standard. Those who fear mobs admire a president who refuses to see the courts trampled. Those who peddle patronage curse an executive who refuses to refill the trough. Those who sit in counting houses and watch the Treasury's reserve fall. Bless a man who chooses partnership with bankers over a pageant of bankruptcy. Over time, as the panic dissolves into cycles, the shape of his contributions stands apart from the pain of his seasons. He clarified the moral logic of civil service at the precise moment when temptation was greatest to abandon it. He advanced tariff reform from a debating society to a law, even if that law disappointed him. He embedded in the federal reflex a habit of telling railroads that the tracks are not a private kingdom. He refused annexation when enthusiasm blurred ethics, and then used law to stiffen the national spine against a different colonial temptation. He treated the gold standard as a civic obligation rather than a banker's pet preference. Convinced that the poor suffer most in inflations that flatter the indebted and punish the careful. He was wrong about the instrument that would improve native lives. He was right about the methods that would improve the federal government's integrity. He handled labor with a judge's eye and not enough of a pastor's ear. He taught a nation to hear the word no from the executive mansion, and to understand that no can sometimes be the grammar of future abundance. Consider 3 scenes that catch him in true profile. In the first, he sits with a stack of private pension bills on his desk, each accompanied by a sympathetic letter, and in some cases, a quiet fraud. He signs those that meet a general standard. He vetoes those that do not, and his message is not contempt, but a defense of the Republic. If we are generous, let it be in a way that does not reward trickery and that treats like cases alike. The Congress groans. He keeps at it. Eventually, a more general law absorbs the honest claims. In the second, he listens to arguments about Pullman. Advisors speak of order and revolution, of the inconvenience of sympathy strikes, of mail cars and legal theory. He answers with injunctions and soldiers, and he cannot or will not hear the human music under the legal facts. The decision hurts him in reputation and is consistent with his creed. In the third, he reads a draft about Venezuela and the doctrine born of Monroe's pen. He revises it until the tone is stern but not servile, daring but not theatrical, and he sends to Congress a message that is both a warning and an invitation to arbitrate. The British choose law. The Western Hemisphere breathes a little easier. The president allows himself 1 cigar that night and does not stay up late to read the newspapers. When he leaves office in 1897, his party is tearing itself in two. The silver question has turned Democrats against one another like theologians arguing about grace. William Jennings Bryan is ready to run the countryside with a sermon about crosses and crowns. Cleveland cannot abide the crusade and refuses to pretend. He retires to Princeton, becomes one of those ex-presidents who write letters that count, and watches as the nation chooses stronger executives with a taste for uplift and experiments he has no taste for. He writes on gold and on duty, on civil service examinations, and on the vulgarity of spending simply to prove that power can move money. He remains a guardian of processes against passions, and because passions write songs and processes keep ledgers, he is remembered more politely than warmly. And yet the institutions that matter remember him warmly where the songs have faded. The civil service persists in the habit he helped root. The Navy moves into the steel posture that his first term accelerated and that his successors will exploit. The ICC grows teeth over decades. Its first shy bite, taken in his years, is still a bite. The notion that tariff policy is not merely a fundraiser for government, but an instrument that can be tuned to justice, becomes orthodoxy no matter which party holds the baton. The Monroe Doctrine, shaken out of its sentimental casing, becomes an argument law can sustain. Even the bond deal, despised by farmers who saw only the names of bankers, reads to later accountants of catastrophe like a man shoring a levee with the sandbags he has because it is raining too hard to manufacture new ones. To understand his cast of mind, imagine him late in his second term, the panic not yet turned, letters stacked in untidy gravity on his desk. Here is a note from a widow asking for a special bill and a clerk's summary that says the facts do not meet the standard. Here is a petition from a Western congressman asking for a new postmaster and a memorandum from the commission that the applicant failed the exam. He writes a polite refusal and a private line to the commission praising their stubbornness. Here is a cable about Venezuela, and he writes one word in the margin, arbitrate, because he believes that word is a bridge between dignity and peace. Here is a report on the reserve, a number that is either the floor of a new confidence or the ceiling on a new panic. He reads, decides, signs, and when he finally closes the lamp, he does so with the calm of a man who has never mistaken applause for legitimacy. Grover Cleveland was never fashionable. He did not flatter the country with perorations. He scolded it with principles. He believed government should be trustworthy before it is inspiring, solvent before it is generous, lawful before it is loud. He did not get every judgment right, and in places where his imagination failed, on the allotment of tribal lands, in the understanding of labor's grievances, his errors were not merely intellectual, but human. Still, he left behind a government measurably less corruptible than he found it, a presidency less willing to auction its counters, a habit of law in foreign affairs that made strength less brittle and more useful, a tariff conversation more honest, and a currency held together long enough for prosperity to resume its natural work. In an age in love with expansion, he resisted one annexation and proved that a doctrine can be enforced with pen and patience. In a decade of anger, he practiced a temperate executive minimalism that angered both radicals and machines and served the Republic. He was the custodian president at the moment when the house might have burned for lack of one. If a statue were to be raised to him, it would not be grand. It would show a big man seated with papers in his lap, a pen uncapped, listening for the word in a sentence that does not belong there. It would be placed not in a plaza designed for parades, but near a courthouse or a post office, places where citizens go to see if government works today. It would suit him. That proximity to lines and counters and the hum of ordinary transactions made possible by laws that do not pretend to be poems. The inscription would be short. Public office is a public trust. It would be enough because he spent a career proving that the plainest sentences are the ones that can carry the most weight.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be.